What's up, everyone? Hope everybody's having a great day. Today, we need to talk about something that has completely changed our understanding of the Greg Biffle tragedy. New audio has surfaced, and folks, when you hear what was actually said in those final minutes, it's going to hit you hard. These recordings captured the actual crisis as it unfolded, and the words transmitted from that aircraft paint a picture that's both heartbreaking and revealing. We're talking about real transmissions from the cockpit that somehow remained hidden for days after the crash. And what they tell us about those final moments is something every pilot and every family member of someone who flies needs to hear. So let me set the stage for you, because the way this audio came to light is almost as remarkable as what it contains. Several days after the crash, when most of us thought we'd heard everything there was to hear, audio of unknown origin suddenly appeared. Now, I've been following aviation incidents for years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Usually, when there's radio communication from an emergency flight, it goes viral within hours. Live ATC picks it up, social media spreads it, and everyone's talking about it immediately. But not this time. This audio stayed hidden, stayed quiet until someone at the FBO, the fixed base operator at Statesville, decided it needed to be heard. Here's what makes this even more extraordinary. There were multiple witnesses at that FBO when these transmissions came through. We're talking about people who were just going about their day, maybe getting coffee, maybe checking weather, and suddenly they're hearing an emergency unfold in real time over the radio speakers. One of them had the presence of mind to pull out their phone and record what they were hearing. And thank God they did, because what they captured changes everything we thought we knew about this tragedy. The voice on the recording, and multiple sources now confirm, this was Jack Dutton, the young Auburn University flight student who was in that aircraft with his father Dennis and the Biffle family. 26 years old, junior in the professional flight program, and based on these recordings, he was the one making the radio calls. Now, that itself raises huge questions, because remember, Jack didn't have a multi-engine rating. He wasn't citation certified, yet here he is handling the radios during what became a fatal emergency. And folks, when you hear how he handled it, when you hear the words he chose, it's going to stay with you. Let me play you what we're talking about. The recording quality isn't perfect because it was captured on a phone recording a radio speaker, but the words are clear enough. Quote, "We have an issue. We're getting everything going. We're getting our gear down. We'll take off runway 10, end quote. Now, I want you to think about those words for a second. We have an issue. Not mayday, not emergency, not engine failure, just an issue. That choice of words tells us something important about what was happening in that cockpit. Either they didn't fully understand what they were dealing with yet, or they were trying to minimize the situation, maybe to avoid panic, maybe to maintain some sense of control. But here's where it gets even more revealing. In subsequent transmissions, and there were 5 total according to witnesses, the language becomes more urgent. The calm, professional tone starts to crack just slightly. Not panic, but you can hear the stress building. You can hear someone who's trying to hold it together while everything around them is falling apart. And remember, this is a 26-year-old kid who's suddenly thrust into the middle of an aviation emergency in an aircraft he wasn't even rated to fly. What's particularly haunting about these recordings is what happens to the audio quality toward the end. The transmissions start strong, clear, easily understood. But as the flight progresses, as the aircraft gets lower, the signal starts to degrade. Aviation experts who've analyzed this say that's consistent with an aircraft losing line of sight to the antenna because of extremely low altitude. In other words, we can literally hear them descending toward their fate through the degradation of the radio signal. That's not something you can fake. That's physics telling us a story about those final moments. Now let's talk about what rough engine actually means in aviation terms, because this is crucial. When a pilot says rough engine, they're not talking about a complete failure. They're describing something more insidious. Maybe it's vibration that shouldn't be there. Maybe it's power surges or reductions. Maybe it's the kind of mechanical distress that makes you know something's very wrong, but doesn't immediately tell you how wrong. And in a citation, at low altitude with marginal weather, that uncertainty can be more dangerous than a clean engine failure. Because at least with a clear failure, you know exactly what you're dealing with. The timing of these transmissions matters too. The first one comes shortly after takeoff, when they're maybe 1,000 feet up and starting their initial turn. At that point, the voice is calm, almost matter-of-fact. By the final transmission, roughly 8 minutes later, you can hear the situation has deteriorated significantly. Not in what's being said, but in how it's being said. The pauses are longer. The words are more carefully chosen. It's the sound of someone who's running out of options and knows it. Here's something that really struck me when I listened to these recordings multiple times. There's no sound of alarms in the background. Aviation experts have pointed this out, and it's significant. If there was a fire, if there was catastrophic engine failure, you'd expect to hear warning systems going off. Master caution alarms, engine fire warnings, terrain warnings, something. But the background is remarkably quiet. What that suggests is this wasn't a sudden catastrophic event. This was a gradually deteriorating situation where the crew was trying to manage a problem that kept getting worse. The witnesses at the FBO describe a scene that's hard to imagine. They're inside going about their business when suddenly these transmissions start coming through. At first, they might not have paid much attention. Radio traffic is normal at an airport. But as the transmissions continue, as the situation becomes clearer, the atmosphere in that room changed. People stopped what they were doing. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Everyone turned toward the radio, knowing they were witnessing something serious unfolding in real time. One witness later described how they could hear other aircraft in the area reacting to the transmissions. There was that Aztec that had taken off right behind the Biffle plane, and you can actually hear in the background of one recording the Aztec pilot asking if they need assistance. Think about that for a moment. You're flying along, everything's normal, and suddenly you're hearing another aircraft declaring an emergency. You're probably looking out your windows trying to spot them, wondering if there's anything you can do, knowing there probably isn't, but feeling compelled to offer anyway. What makes this audio even more significant is how the NTSB initially handled questions about it. In their first press briefing, when asked directly if the crew had declared an emergency, the spokesperson seemed to dance around the question. They mentioned audio recordings, but wouldn't confirm what was on them. It wasn't until the second briefing, after this audio had already started circulating in aviation circles, that they admitted yes, there was clearly an emergency situation. That reluctance to acknowledge what was on these recordings raises serious questions about transparency and what else might be known but not yet shared. The technical analysis of this audio has been fascinating. Experts have confirmed with high confidence that this is genuine VHF aviation communication, not something created after the fact. The noise floor, the static patterns, the bandwidth limitations, all consistent with actual radio transmission. You can't fake these characteristics easily. This isn't someone with an aviation app on their phone trying to create a hoax. This is real radio traffic captured in real time during a real emergency. But here's where things get really interesting and somewhat controversial. The voice on the recording sounds young. Multiple people who've listened to it have independently come to the same conclusion. This sounds like Jack, not Dennis. And if that's true, if the youngest, least experienced person in that cockpit was the one handling communications, what does that tell us about what was happening? Was Dennis too busy flying to talk? Was he dealing with the mechanical issue? Or was there another reason why Jack ended up being the voice of that aircraft in its final moments? Let me paint you a picture of what those 10 minutes must have been like inside that citation. You've just taken off runway 10. You're climbing through maybe 1,000 feet when something doesn't feel right. Maybe it's a vibration. Maybe it's a power asymmetry. Maybe it's that roughness they mentioned. Dennis is in the left seat, probably takes the controls immediately. He's got thousands of hours, but mostly in big Boeings at Delta. This citation is different, smaller, less forgiving. Greg Biffle is likely in one of the passenger seats. He's a pilot himself, but this isn't his airplane to fly right now. And Jack is in the right seat, young, eager to help, but lacking the experience and ratings to be truly useful in this situation. The decision gets made quickly. We're turning back. But turning back isn't simple in a jet. You can't just yank it around like a Cessna. You need to manage your energy. You need to coordinate your turn. You need to decide which runway you're going to use. And all of this while whatever caused you to turn back is still happening, still demanding attention, still degrading your performance. So Jack takes the radios. It's something he can do, something that helps without requiring the ratings he doesn't have. And for the next 8 minutes, he becomes the voice of that aircraft, telling the world what's happening, even as the situation spirals beyond recovery. The phrase, "we're getting everything going," haunts me. It suggests multiple things happening at once. Systems being activated or deactivated, checklists being run, configuration changes being made. But it also suggests a crew that's task-saturated, trying to do too many things at once. In aviation, we have a saying, aviate, navigate, communicate, in that order. But when you're low on altitude with an engine problem near an airport in marginal weather, those priorities can get jumbled. You're trying to aviate, but the engine isn't cooperating. You're trying to navigate, but you're not sure which runway gives you the best chance. You're trying to communicate, but there's so much happening inside the cockpit that forming coherent sentences becomes a challenge. The mention of getting our gear down is particularly telling. That's not something you normally announce on the radio. Extending landing gear is routine. You just do it. The fact that Jack felt compelled to announce it suggests maybe they were extending gear earlier than normal. Maybe they were trying to slow down because of that rough engine. Maybe they were configuring for landing while still trying to figure out which runway to use. Whatever the reason, that transmission reveals a crew that's trying to get ahead of a deteriorating situation, but may actually be falling further behind. What's heartbreaking is that Charlotte Douglas Airport was just 32 miles away. A major airport with long runways, full emergency services, and professional air traffic control. Had they climbed to altitude, declared a proper emergency, and accepted vectors to Charlotte, the outcome might have been different. But hindsight is cruel that way. In the moment, with an engine running rough, with weather marginal, with the departure airport right there in sight, the decision to return immediately must have seemed like the right call, the safe call, the conservative call. The degradation of the audio signal in those final transmissions tells its own story. Radio waves travel in straight lines. When an aircraft is high, the signal is strong and clear, reaching multiple receivers over a wide area. But as the aircraft descends, terrain and obstacles start blocking that signal. Trees, buildings, even the curvature of the earth can interfere. So when we hear Jack's voice getting weaker, more broken up, we're literally hearing the aircraft descending below the radio horizon. We're hearing physics confirm what the flight data suggests, that they were getting dangerously low trying to make that runway. There's another aspect to these recordings that hasn't been widely discussed, the absence of standard emergency phraseology. Pilots are trained to use specific words in emergencies. Mayday for grave and imminent danger, pan-pan for urgent situations, declaring emergency to get priority handling. But none of these appear in the recordings. Instead, we get, "we have an issue." This could mean several things. Maybe they didn't think the situation was severe enough for formal emergency declaration. Maybe they thought they could handle it without needing emergency services. Or maybe, and this is speculation, but maybe the lack of proper emergency phraseology reflects the inexperience of the person making the calls. The witnesses describe how, after the final transmission from the citation, there was this eerie silence. The radio that had been crackling with urgent communication suddenly went quiet. Then, moments later, a different voice came on. An airport worker informing other traffic that the airport was closed. No explanation, just closed. And everyone in that FBO knew what that meant. They knew the citation hadn't made it. They'd heard the emergency unfold, and now they were hearing the aftermath beginning. What strikes me most about these recordings is how they humanize this tragedy. These aren't just statistics or flight data points. This is a young man's voice trying to save himself, his father, and family friends. This is someone's son, working through an emergency he was never fully trained for. This is the sound of people doing their absolute best in an impossible situation. And that makes it so much harder to listen to because we know how it ends. The fact that these recordings remained hidden, or at least uncirculated, for days raises important questions. Who made the decision not to immediately release them? Was it out of respect for the families? Was it because of ongoing investigation concerns? Or was there something about what's on these recordings that made officials hesitant to share them? The NTSB's initial reluctance to acknowledge the emergency declaration captured in these transmissions suggests there may have been sensitivity about what these recordings revealed about the crew composition and qualifications. When you combine what we hear in these recordings with what we know about the flight path, the picture becomes clearer, but no less tragic. An aircraft takes off and almost immediately encounters problems. A young pilot without proper ratings finds himself in a critical role during an emergency. A crew tries to manage a deteriorating situation while dealing with marginal weather and tight margins. Configuration decisions get made that increase drag and decrease performance. And through it all, a calm young voice keeps transmitting, keeps trying to communicate their position and intentions, even as options disappear one by one. The roughness they reported could have been many things: foreign object damage to an engine from a possibly open baggage door, compressor stall, fuel system problems, mechanical failure of engine components. Without the full NTSB report, we're left to speculate. But what these recordings make clear is that whatever the problem was, it was significant enough to cause an immediate return, and urgent enough that normal procedures may have been abbreviated or skipped entirely. There's a lesson in these recordings for every pilot who listens to them. When you hear that young voice trying to manage an emergency, it's a reminder that emergencies don't always happen to other people. They can happen to anyone, at any time. And when they do, the decisions you make in those first critical seconds can determine everything that follows. The decision to declare a formal emergency, the decision to climb or stay low, the decision to configure early or stay clean. Each choice narrows or expands your options for what comes next. The recording also raises questions about crew resource management in Part 91 operations. In airline operations, roles are clearly defined. The captain flies, the first officer handles radios and checklists. Everyone knows their job. But in private operations, especially with mixed experience levels and informal arrangements, those roles can become blurred. Who's really in charge? Who makes the critical decisions? Who speaks for the aircraft? These aren't just administrative questions. In an emergency, clear roles and responsibilities can mean the difference between coordinated response and chaos. As I've listened to these recordings over and over, certain phrases stick with me. We have an issue. Such understated words for such a serious situation. We're getting everything going. The sound of a crew trying to multitask their way out of danger, getting our gear down, the configuration decision that may have sealed their fate. Each phrase reveals something about what was happening in that cockpit. Together, they tell the story of 10 minutes that changed everything for two families and left the aviation community searching for answers and lessons. What's perhaps most tragic is that everyone in that aircraft was trying to do the right thing. Dennis Dutton, with his decades of airline experience, was probably drawing on everything he'd learned in his career. Greg Biffle, an accomplished pilot himself, was likely offering whatever assistance he could. And Jack, thrust into a situation beyond his training, was doing his best to be helpful, to contribute, to communicate. There were no villains in that cockpit, just people facing an extraordinary situation with ordinary human limitations. The technical quality of these recordings has been analyzed extensively. The way the static interacts with the voice, the bandwidth limitations of VHF radio, the absence of studio acoustics or digital artifacts, everything points to these being genuine recordings of actual transmissions. Which means we're hearing history. We're hearing the actual voices from an aircraft that would never land safely. We're hearing someone's last words transmitted to the world. And that weight, That responsibility to treat these recordings with respect while still learning from them is something the aviation community takes seriously. In the days following the crash, as these recordings circulated among pilots and aviation enthusiasts, the reactions were consistent. Heartbreak at hearing such young voice managing such crisis. Frustration at hearing the situation deteriorate. Recognition of the impossible position the crew found themselves in. And underlying it all, questions about whether different decisions might have led to different outcomes. Not blame, but inquiry. Not judgment, but learning. The recordings also highlight the importance of proper emergency communication. When you declare an emergency properly, when you use the right words, you get resources. ATC clears airspace for you. Emergency vehicles start rolling. Other aircraft give you priority. The system is designed to help, but only if you activate it. The informal language in these recordings suggests the crew may not have fully engaged those emergency resources until it was too late. As we process what these recordings mean, it's important to remember they're just one piece of a larger puzzle. The NTSB will combine them with flight data, radar tracks, wreckage analysis, and countless other factors to build a complete picture of what happened. But for those of us listening now, these recordings provide something else. They provide a human connection to what can often feel like a clinical investigation. They remind us that behind every accident statistic are real people making real decisions under incredible pressure. So when we talk about that rough engine, when we listen to Jack's voice growing fainter as the aircraft descends, when we hear the efforts to get everything going, we're not just analyzing an accident. We're witnessing the final moments of people who deserved better, who deserved more time, more altitude, more options. And if we can learn from what we hear, if we can translate their experience into safer operations for others, then maybe their voices, captured in these recordings, can help prevent future tragedies. The recordings end with static. Not a dramatic cut-off, just a gradual fade as the aircraft drops below the radio horizon. And then silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any words. The kind that tells you everything has changed. The witnesses at the FBO described how that silence hung in the air, how nobody knew quite what to say or do. They'd just heard history unfold. They just witnessed tragedy in real time. And now, they held recordings that would become critical evidence in understanding what went wrong. These recordings exist because someone had the presence of mind to press record on their phone, because they recognized they were witnessing something significant. That simple action preserved evidence that might otherwise have been lost. It gave investigators another tool for understanding the accident. It gave families insights into their loved ones' final moments, and it gave the aviation community another opportunity to learn, to improve, to hopefully prevent the next one. Thank you all for watching and for treating this topic with the seriousness it deserves. These recordings are difficult to hear, but important to understand. Please share your thoughts respectfully below. If you have experience with similar situations, if you faced emergencies in flight, your insights could help others. Remember, we analyze these tragedies not to assign blame, but to learn. Every lesson learned from this accident could save lives in the future. Stay safe out there, everyone, and we'll see you at the checkered flag.